Welcome, everyone, to Latter Daily Digest. We honor creators, and today I'm joined by Julia of Analyzing Mormonism. Thanks, Julia, for hopping on.
Yeah, of course.
And Julie will also share this with her audience. And if you're in my audience, head out to Analyzing Mormonism and subscribe to her channel. And we're welcoming John G. Turner and Ganesh, some sort of initial maybe, Cherian.
You can't be a true Mormon unless you have a middle initial, but I try not to reveal it for
I don't know how many other authors released books on Joseph Smith this year, but we have 2 of them right now.
I'm sure you could find a couple more out there.
Yeah. And so thanks you guys for coming on the show.
I feel very fortunate to be here, and John's an incredible scholar, and his book is amazing, and so I'm really glad to talk about Joseph, our shared passion together.
So we honor creators, and we thought we would sort of talk about the things that they experienced as they were writing, or even prior to that, compiling an idea, the germ of the thought to write a book. And so I'll start with John. John, when did you have the idea that you would start a book on Joseph Smith?
Thanks, Gene. I'm also just going to preface it by I think it is wonderful to be doing this show with Ganesh, simply because, so I grew up 45 minutes or so away from Palmyra, New York. So right near where the Joseph Smith story really started. And I didn't grow up I've never been a Latter-day Saint. I don't think I knew any Latter-day Saints when I was growing up. And Ganesh, he's from the other side of the world. He's a lifelong Latter-day Saint. And here we are, both having written books that came out this year.
It's a miracle.
Joseph Smith. Yeah, well, the Lord or the world works in mysterious ways.
That's right.
But so for me, I've been interested in Mormon history now for quite some time, going on 20 years. I got interested in the subject in part because about the time that Mitt Romney was getting ready to run for president.
The Mormon moment.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested in the intersection between Mormonism and conservative politics in the United States. But I ended up doing a couple of projects, not on that, but on other Latter-day Saint subjects. And then about 5 years ago, I decided, I sort of have this lingering interest to better understand the founding figure, and I plunged into researching a biography on Joseph Smith.
Did you find him quite different than Brigham Young? Were you surprised how different the 2 men were as the basis of Mormonism?
I mean, so yes and no. I mean, I think in some ways there's a tendency to want to draw a natural sort of contrast between these 2 founding figures. So Joseph the prophet, maybe even Joseph the mystic, and Brigham Young the hard-nosed and practical organizer. And I think there's some truth to that. But Brigham also actually had a lot of spiritual fire, especially when he was younger. And Joseph, in a way, was also very much a practical community builder. I mean, shorter lived communities, but different circumstances. So yeah, they're different, but they also have some real, points that connect.
Joseph was kind of like a combined real estate salesperson and city planner.
Yeah, and booster, right? Definitely. Ganesh,
how did you come up with this thought?
Well, mine didn't start off really looking at Joseph Smith too much. I had looked at some of the things around the Book of Mormon and the church, really. Those are my 2 points that didn't always square, right? The Book of Mormon, often taught things that were quite different by Nauvoo and what we kind of internalize as the church now. And I, after seeing a few things from other scholars, particularly William Davis and his book, Vision of the Seer Stone, and also Dan McClellan's work on biblical criticism, which spilled a little bit over into Mormonism. I really wanted to understand why we had one particular thing in the Book of Mormon and sometimes quite a different thing in the church. And, when I started to look at that and start to detail some of those differences and how they changed, it was obvious that Joseph was the reason. And so then just taking those 2 points and looking at the in-between, right? What happened to change them, but also what had happened in Joseph's life to make what was in the Book of Mormon seem possible or real, and then what happened after Joseph's death that either cemented the things that had come to pass in Nauvoo, or even maybe a regression back to what had happened in the Book of Mormon. So that's how it ended up being a biography of Joseph. My book, it really started out with just trying to explain these little oddities of the church, but ended up being, well, the only way to explain it is really to understand what's happening to Joseph in the moment, and that's how it came up. And so part of that is that, of course, my book and John's book are quite different because he's doing a whole chronology from birth to death, and I segment it by topic because I'm looking at how things are changing because of what's happening to Joseph.
It was part of your curiosity that you felt maybe like in Sunday school you didn't get enough church history. First of all, it's every 4 years, and second of all, it's the same stuff.
Yes, well, John's right. I grew up in New Zealand, of course. It's a long way away from the States, although I married an American, so and my children are all American. So I had gone back and forth to the States for quite a bit. But until I lived there and lived in Wyoming for some time, I didn't understand. And I guess it's just the difference between being a tourist and living someplace is that a lot of the cultural identity of America seemed to be infused with the church, and I hadn't grasped that before living in the States. And so that made me think about it. And it was actually, as John said, the presidential race between Obama and Mitt Romney. That was when I was living in Wyoming, and those kind of intersections between politics and religion and how they played out in the States really were my delving into church history, because I thought I knew stuff, and then when it didn't happen the way I expected, I had to know why it was different, and that led to lots of church history. Of course, the Gospel Topics essays were released soon after that, which validated a lot of things I'd already come to learn, and that was tough as a member of the church who had a particular idea, and that changed. But also, once I started to delve into the stories, I realized that there was a lot of richness there that I had not known and wanted to know. They weren't very affirmative of the faithful narrative, but they certainly gave a great insight into human nature, and I think that's something that is powerful about Mormonism and the Mormon story, that is very you can see how things build and create and splinter and develop. These are all very human things, and Mormonism is a great petri dish to examine human nature and aspiration and exploration and even destruction. So that's really what happened.
So I have a question that I am really interested in. So I like, Ganesh, what you were saying. Like, I thought I knew church history, but I didn't really. Like, I was even the gospel doctrine teacher in my ward, and I feel like I did not know church history. But like, maybe we can start with you, Dr. Turner. What did you guys learn that surprised you or that maybe excited you when you guys did your research, both respectively?
Sure. And you're going to have to call me John. I don't want to be Dr. Turner up against
No.
Ganesh.
That's right. And I have a sore in my side, Dr. Turner. I wonder if you can help me with that.
That's like but that's like history PhD versus God, if you phrase it like that, right? Ganesh is more impressive. So, so some things that surprised me. I mean, so many things, and I mean, I've been thinking about Joseph Smith for about 20 years, which is longer than this biography. But I would say one thing that really surprised me at the outset that might seem obvious, perhaps to many listeners, but wasn't obvious to me, was just how central engagement with the Bible was to Joseph Smith. Like that's not a I think that's not a very sexy thing to say about Joseph Smith, but from the beginning of his sort of prophetic career, with the Book of Mormon to plural marriage and the King Follett discourse, a lot of his ideas come from rumination on biblical passages and teasing out memory and wondering about them. So that was surprising. And I'd say one other one that was surprising to me, or that I wouldn't have expected, which Joseph himself would have a ready explanation for, is this guy was a physical force. It's well known, of course, he liked to wrestle and pull at sticks, but there he is in 1843, beating up a Hancock County tax collector. I think kind of enjoying it. Or there he is, staggering into Quincy, Illinois, and he's off a couple days later to get going, buying land in what becomes Nauvoo. So, there's this reflective, I think, side of Joseph Smith that I hadn't necessarily fully appreciated, but there's also just this physical force that, that's kind of hard to capture in writing, I think, but that also stood out to me.
That's really cool. I like those answers. And I think I was thinking of your first answer. I think from a Mormon perspective, because I think we all are aware that Joseph quoted a lot from the Bible. But another way of saying that is that he didn't quote very much, if at all, or just paraphrase the Book of Mormon. Because that's our central text. But Joseph barely ever, I don't think he ever quoted directly from it in his sermons. I think he just paraphrased it. So that kind of startled me when I learned that, because he's mostly just preaching from the Bible. So that's really interesting. And then, him being a physical force, that's for sure. Yeah, I feel surprised too, because he wrestled, but I didn't realize he was beating people up. And there was at least three of the criminal cases against him that he was a defendant on, that there was violence involved, and that was really interesting.
He did get beat up by his brother William once, so he didn't always win. But sorry,
okay,
go ahead, Ganesh.
No, that's a good add-in.
For me, it was understanding how poor he was. His family was desperate, and I think that there's the two things that I got from that, which were really big, was he was really came from humble circumstances. He was really in a bad place, financially. His family was in destitution, right? They'd lost the family farm. The parents were older. There was just a sense of loss and urgency that, things were they were bad and they were just going to get worse. So that feeling, I think I hadn't really appreciated about Joseph prior to really looking at his early life. And the other part of that was that his family had come from relative wealth. They were, maybe upper middle class. They had long generations in New England. They were thought of well. And so there's that two parts of that. One is that, he was incredibly poor, but also that he'd come from, or that he had this heritage of something special, and that he was trying to live up to, even maybe redeem his family to. They really were the poor cousins, and they were looked down upon by the other family members who had given them money and they've lost it. They continue to have, copious amounts of children, even though they couldn't afford it. So you can almost hear the disdains, particularly in the letter that Jesse, Uncle Jesse, who's the favored uncle, the one who took Joseph to the seaside to convalesce after his leg surgery, but also kind of the semi-head of the Smith family after Asa was getting quite senior, and he writes a scathing letter to the Smiths, particularly to Hiram, about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and what right does Joseph have to do this? Like he's, really is down on him, and I think you can hear in that the disdain that some members of the extended family had toward the Smiths, and also you can hear in the Book of Mormon the response that Joseph gives of my words are weak. If we could have written this in Hebrew, it would be perfect. But I'm powerful in speaking, but not great at writing. Which was Joseph to a T, right? He could have defended himself against Jesse, with his words, except for that he had to write them down. He doesn't have that eloquence with the writing. So he's a speaker, not a writer. And the kind of ways that those prophets in the Book of Mormon defend themselves as, you're going to see me at this pleasing bar of Christ, and you're going to know that I told you the truth. I hear in that Joseph just, really trying to speak to people, particularly his family, his extended family, who are down on him as an authority. And it's just, really interesting to hear those dynamics play out. And of course, most members of the church, people who convert to Mormonism, they're often from poverty backgrounds, from powerless backgrounds, and so the words of the Book of Mormon are really powerful. They I think one of the reasons why it's so compelling is that it speaks to that injustice of being on the lesser, being the outcast, being the poor, being the powerless, and suggests that this makes you humble, that this makes you closer to God. And I think this encapsulates absolutely what Joseph felt about himself, how he felt about his immediate family, and how he was defending himself against his community and his extended family, who just thought that the Smiths were, a little odd, maybe a waste of space, and I think that's what, if we're thinking about why Mormonism has been so compelling, it is because when people, they feel that when they read the Book of Mormon, and it often relates to people who are in desperate circumstances.
Yeah, thank you. That also makes me think of with the financial predicament that he and his family were in, and maybe the poverty, maybe below the poverty line after a while. I think it also changes my perspective as far as Joseph Smith's treasure digging, or all the folklore that they were all involved in. Because people always think of him as he's scamming people, he's just a fraud. But if you look at his family and his family circumstances, they were just trying to make ends meet with their family. And like you said, they had a lot of kids. I think even William Davis talks about how they struggled to pay for schooling. And then I think the government helped with some of the kids. And I just think about senior Joseph was just really trying to make ends meet to get his family taken care of. And so I don't think he was doing it in any kind of malicious way. I think he genuinely believed that there was treasure. And so that just kind of changes the perspective to be more kind and understanding. And I really appreciate that you shared that.
Treasure digging was kind of like the lottery of its day.
Yeah.
Who are the people who gamble the most? It's those who they're just waiting for a big payout, and things are desperate. They're not improving in a way that makes them feel like they're in control of their lives. So
That's right.
Treasure digging was a form of entertainment, but it was also a form of getting excited about your life. So
just like today, lemonade stands and bake sales don't make as much money as treasure digging in the lottery.
Yeah, that's right.
So I wanted to ask, what was I don't know if you guys have thought about this, but what was the most difficult part of writing both of these books?
Why don't you take that one first, Ganesh?
Finishing it was the biggest part, because
Finishing, is that what you said?
finishing
Was the biggest part.
Every time I listened to a podcast or read something from the Joseph Smith Papers Project, or like I just find something else, and it would just be endless. Or I would talk to somebody, often because mine's so broad in terms of its scope. I enlisted the help of a lot of people and send them chapters or send them sections, and they'd come back to me with other thoughts or places to read, or background to research. And of course that just kept extending the time frame, because I wanted to be really accurate, but also it was just so fascinating and interesting, and I found that it was endless. And it still is endless. There's almost a point where you just have to draw a line in the sand and go, okay, this is enough. This will at least get people's appetite wet, and they can furnish me with stuff that will help to get.
Right, so I want to add really quick before John answers that question. So there must have been a point where you were like, okay, this is enough, this is done. Like, I feel like that would have been really hard.
It was very hard, and it really was about my the formatter. So I had an editor, and the editor went through lots of things and gave me tons of things to change. And then I got to the point where I was like, I just have to get this out. So I enlisted a formatter to put it into a format which I could upload it. And then and so that kind of gave it a hard line where it was very difficult to add from there without changing the format and without her having to do a whole lot more work. And so that kind of forced the stop. And I think sometimes you have to give yourself some hard stops.
Yeah.
So you sort of did it like stone broth or nail soup, where the pot was just getting bigger and bigger because everybody was adding to it and you were finding things to put in it. So it just got too big for any more.
Yeah, it could still go on, and I hope that it does to some extent, because I'm sure. I mean, it has turned out to be a bit of a reference book kind of a thing, because you can search it by subject, so which is really cool. But there are just other data points that I missed or maybe misinterpreted, and so it really I hope that it has a life beyond just the printed format. It can be changed, it can be updated, and hopefully is more accurate over time.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Turner or John. What did you find is the most difficult part with writing Joseph Smith?
Well, I mean, I had a chronological structure, so he had to die at some point. So, that's really helpful in terms of finishing biographies. I think it's tough. It's tough to. I mean, you can never really have a manuscript be good enough, right? Because if you had another 10 or 20 people read it, they would find more errors. You could always make better judgments about what to include or not include. One of my goals was not to write a super monumentally long biography of Joseph Smith. So I did have a process where I probably trimmed the whole thing by 20 or 25%. I did, my editor didn't seem to understand that academics generally don't meet deadlines. So we're supposed to just be able to work on things indefinitely, at least after we have tenure. So once in a while, I'd get this nagging email from my editor that made me, I have this inward Calvinist guilt then for having sinned by having fallen short of the glory of my deadline. And so that kind of got me to the finish line.
That's good.
Did you think about changing things depending on whether a source could be had more credibility than others, or that you were going to not include something and then you found a backup and so you added that, or you had a source and somebody said, well, that's not a very good source because of some reasons, and so you took that out? Is that part of the process?
Yeah, so I'll just give one specific example, and I don't have all the sources in my head at the moment, but I did do probably a third pass on the Fanny Alger story near the finish line, because in that instance, pretty much all of the sources are, could be impugned for one reason or another, or they're just more vague than one would like. And so I did give that a few passes. And in that instance, I tried to be more explicit about the biases in the various sources. Most of the time, I think when you're writing a narrative biography, you can't spend too much time gumming everything up with, well, here's a source, here's what it says, but we can't fully trust it because of this reason. And I think oftentimes you have to try to get on with telling the story with the best available evidence. But sometimes I felt like I had to take another pass on things and maybe more explicitly engage some of the challenges.
I think you did a good job of that, John. I certainly, as reading your book, I felt like you were telling a great story, and you could tell that there was more complexity there, but you needed to move the story along, and so you did a nice balance of being accurate and still engaging the reader to move forward, which I think made it very readable. Excellent.
And how about you, Ganesh?
So I often had things that I had, little phrases or things that I'd found in the Joseph Smith Papers Project, which I'd put into the book, and then I found better ones. So in terms of sources, I actually, because I felt like I was going to be writing mostly to an LDS audience who may not believe what I'm telling them, I really tried to put in a ton of scripture references, so lots of Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants and Pearl of Great Price scriptures, and sometimes in quite a big measure, so that people would have to read them in context with the time. That was the thing that I found really difficult, because I liked it to be much more succinct, but in order to kind of prove what I was saying, I felt like I needed to do that. And oftentimes I'd find better resources or better quotes and such, put them in. It was an ongoing issue. But one of the best things that happened was actually when I started originally, and I talked about this a bit, I talked about the differences between the Book of Mormon and Nauvoo, and I explained that a lot about Joseph Smith's own personal privileges and prejudices that he had, and how they played out. And so that was my kind of first section in the book, because it was the most stark, like it was the things that stood out the best. And so I thought that section was actually the cream of the book. And I started to develop other ideas and areas which I could. And one of the things that the editor said was, actually what you should do is talk about things up front in the book that are more general, and then just get narrower and narrower as you go, and in terms of explaining Joseph. So she got me to reorder the chapters and the sections so that it would have that flavor. And so it did that kind of settlers first, the settler worldview, the Native American understanding, theology, then prejudices, and then folk magic. So it kind of funneled and narrowed. But that caused me to have to kind of do a whole, almost like a rewrite of how I was explaining things. It took me a good 3 months to get my head around that and actually do it reasonably well. And I think still stuff to do.
So can I also ask, so I think the answer might be different for both of you because of your Mormon background and non-Mormon background, but how have your books been received by your audiences? So I guess John, yours, you have a more Mormon audience, I feel like. So maybe the answer is the same, like with family, friends, students, people who are interested.
I mean, my mom's still trying to figure out, why do you bother writing about the Mormons? I don't especially. She has this sort of residual Protestant anti-Mormonism, stoked by the fact that my sister moved to Utah a number of years ago. So, I wish my family would spend less time either with Mormons or writing about Mormons. So I don't know. So I think my mom's a little skeptical. So she's hard to please. I don't. That's a hard question to answer. I mean, I think there's some faithful Latter-day Saints and some ex-Mormons who appreciate my biography and who have enjoyed it and let me know that. That always makes me really happy. I've had a few people let me know that they didn't like it at all. And, well, thanks for reading. And
we're interviewing them next.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. And that'd be great. The only reaction that I don't like is the suggestion that, maybe if you're a faithful Latter-day Saint, you shouldn't read this biography, which I've seen here and there. And I just don't think that's true. Of course.
If you were a faithful Latter-day Saint, you would understand that the glory of God is intelligence, and you'd want to read John's book.
Well, I agree. I totally agree, Gene. I think that actually says way more about Joseph Smith actually than it says about my biography. I think there's some really challenging aspects to his life, to his decisions, even to his ideas that are difficult for people to grapple with. But I think that has a lot less to do with my biography than just with the facts of his life.
There's just a blanket thing. John is not an apostle, so don't listen to him.
Right. Well, that's reasonable.
It is really tricky. Like I think Mormons generally have this. Well, we do. We have this incredible attachment to Joseph. So we don't quite know what to do when that is challenged. It's really tough. I have a number of friends who just when it comes to this book, they are like crickets. They just don't want to talk about it, don't want to think that they firstly don't want to think that they don't know everything about Joseph, and they don't want to think that there's something unsavory about Joseph, and so they kind of just ignore it for those who are really having a struggle. Most of for those who have read it, I've got incredibly great feedback. Maybe it hasn't been read widely enough yet to be pushed back on enough. I feel like there's still much more pushback that needs to happen. So I've had a couple of I was telling John, I have a dear friend who is in the state presidency whose name is John Turner. So, so he's not very excited about my book, mainly because he's a church leader and he feels responsible, and even though we're close, he finds it an affront. So I had some delight telling him that that a man named John Turner, his namesake, had written a biography, and if he had to choose, he should probably read his biography. But it is one of the craziest things that out of all, being a member of the church, that you may feel like you really know Joseph and have a real attachment to him, even bearing testimony of him and his importance in your life over the pulpit, and yet probably have not read anything that resembles a biography of Joseph. So it's a really interesting oddity of our culture is that we ascribe so much and we know so little. And I think that the church probably likes it that way in some ways, because it means that people, invest in the emotion rather than the facts. But it's interesting when people have to deal with that some of the facts about Joseph are not the ones that endear them towards him. So that's a real tension which is happening through thousands of families, particularly as people, because everybody has somebody in their family, somebody close to them who has left the church, often over something that Joseph has done, which seems terrible. And so that part of the reason I kept going with the book was the idea of trying to help those two groups of people talk to each other, because members often feel very betrayed when their family leaves, and people and it creates a whole lot of hurt. And so hopefully if people who have left can feel validated, oh yes, this is not just in my imagination, these are really tough subjects, and people who are staying can read and go, oh, this is not nothing, these are really tough conversations that would help them to bridge some of that gap. So and so far that's the feedback I've got, so I'm happy that's my hope for the book is somewhat being fulfilled.
Steve Pinecker prides himself on his interfaith work and things that he's associated, and in a way Ganesh's book is inter-Mormon faith work.
Yeah, well, I was a bishop, so and like I still attend my ward, and even though I don't believe in the truth claims of the church, I really invested in my community, and I see lots of hurt. People come and talk to me all the time about the distance that they have with their family members for various reasons, and it is heartbreaking. And I'm fortunate that I can be a bit of a go-between. I was talking to somebody the other day. I was saying, in Mormonism, there's just a line. You're either faithful or you're an apostate. There's just nowhere in between. Like it's just that we don't have a word for that. But in Christianity, there's a word, right? Heretic is the word where you might engage in something but not believe in others. And we live that. We just don't have a word for it. And so maybe I could be a useful heretic is my moniker for being in between and hopefully allowing a bit of conversation between those two poles. They don't actually exist like that in real life, but that's how they're portrayed to members, and that's how often members react to people if they're not completely doing everything that they're supposed to.
Right. I think people are naturally good, but when there's something comes up that's uncomfortable, they retreat back to their polar sort of positions, the safe place or something, instead of, we'll say, being loving and Christian towards everyone. They kind of go to their group instead.
That's human nature too, right?
Right.
So how do we create safe spaces? How do we talk about hard things? How do we engage in this? And I think actually, reading John's book and working on mine have made me feel like actually Joseph Smith is a great place. A biography of Joseph is a great place to engage in this, because we're doing with an actual human. It is somebody that we're connected to, but when you read a story, like you were saying earlier, Julia, that you get that feeling of, gosh, this guy was in a really hard place. I have huge empathy for Joseph's 23-year-old self. He was making his way in the world. He didn't know where the money was coming from. He felt like he had to save his family because they were really on the brink. And he survived. He did what he needed to do to survive, and it kind of snowballed. I think at some point he got emboldened and entitled, and he took liberties which were terrible. But there was, and I think that's also a great story of human nature. But if we can have empathy for that young Joseph, and maybe understanding for how it turned into something else, that there's a bit of peace in that for both people who have left and feel really betrayed, and even for people who stay and feel like, oh well, I want to navigate this with the humanness and the charity and the empathy that allows community. So
I love that. Wait, so I have a question about, this is kind of along those lines, but I have a question about biases. So I feel like it'd be really hard to write a history or even any kind of the books that you guys have written without developing a bias one way or another. Like you read Fawn Brody and her bias comes out pretty strong, but you can like pick apart or set apart her bias with her history. But I feel like with both your books, as far as I can remember, they remain pretty neutral. And so I just wanted to ask, like, what was that like? Were you tempted to lean favoring Joseph or like criticizing Joseph, or what was that like?
John, how do you
Yeah,
manage it?
I mean, that's a great question. To be honest, I mean, I don't mean to sound, I don't know, like praising my own even-handedness too much, but I felt like for the most part, I was free to follow the evidence. And I suppose my own presuppositions and biases that might shape the way I view some of the evidence, but I tried to be fair rather than neutral, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So I didn't think it made sense to be neutral on the question of whether Joseph Smith had gold plates, because that's just not an answer, right? Yeah, there wasn't really a lot of neutral on that one. On some things, maybe it was easier to take a position that would be a little bit more complex. Like with the first vision, it made sense to me that Joseph, given his religious culture and household, that he would have been open to having visions. But I think obviously we can't verify their content. Even if we only had a single narrative, we couldn't verify their content. On some other issues, like plural marriage, I don't think I'm neutral. I tried as hard as I could to state what the evidence was, to point out both the theological underpinnings for how Joseph explained what he was doing, but also to point out the terrible decisions and the significant emotional and ecclesiastical cost. So, I mean, anyone can claim to be even-handed, and readers have to judge that, and not everybody's going to agree. But Joseph's life, the waters are so frothy. I don't know. It's not easy to sail through them.
You could almost say that Joseph's polygamy caused the death of him.
Yeah, not the only factor, but absolutely a catalyst. I mean, it's the primary reason for the cadre of dissenters within the church that lead him to make decisions that his enemies outside the church take advantage of.
And then the laws publishing the Nauvoo Expositor.
Right. Exactly. I mean, so Joseph, it feels very threatened by dissent within the church and within the city in the first half of 1844, which culminates in his decision to order the destruction of this dissenter printing press. And once he does that, and once he also issues a proclamation of martial law, it creates the legal jeopardy that enables his arrest and murder.
Well, in John's book, Joseph dies once. In my book, he dies 45 different times. and for lots of different, I've got one chapter on polygamy, but actually, that was one of the things that's surprising to me too, how much was going on in that last 6 months of his life, and that just wildly different reasons that people were just so upset with with Joseph. The Nauvoo Expositor lists dozens of things. It's really an incredible resource to get a contemporary on the ground, feel of how people were dealing with some of the tough things that were happening in Nauvoo. Certainly polygamy was one of the major ones, but it certainly was, it was one of many, which is crazy.
And to Julia's question about bias.
Yeah, so I really struggle with that because, I'd been through a faith transition, learned that the history wasn't right, felt betrayed. Gosh, I ran several marathons just on the anger I had about things. So, but I'm fortunate that that's 10 years ago, and I worked past that. In fact, that's one of the reasons I thought I could write something like this, because I felt like I could do it with enough empathy and ability of seeing both sides to at least engage in the conversation. I think there definitely are some points where I obviously was biased, because my editor would write to me and go, "That's a bit hard. Can you make that statement a bit more neutral?" That was one of the things that I because sometimes you don't even know the things that kind of are push points for you, trigger moments. And I certainly had plenty of them going through the book. But fortunately, somebody a little bit more objective, and she had left the church too, which is a great editor and able to kind of point out, I think you're being overly simplistic here, or this is too negative, change it. So I did a bit of that. The other person that was really good at helping me look at bias was actually Richard Turley. So I, by a strange set of circumstances, end up staying with Richard lots of times when I go to Utah. And last year when I was staying with him, he had just released his Mountain Meadows Massacre book that he'd done with Barbara Brown. And so we spent a lot of time talking about his book, also how he was able to navigate that in an LDS setting, talking about some really tough subjects, murder amongst the Mormons, right? The idea that particularly those, kind of founders of places like Cedar City were the perpetrators of this incredibly, terrible event. And so, I was really inspired by the way that he was able to navigate a number of those really tough conversations. He went there, he did a number of firesides, he talked to people. Obviously, you may have seen that he and Barbara Brown did a number of outreaches with the Arkansas families. They had come to southern Utah to the Mountain Meadows Massacre site. They'd done a lot of work together. They published that kind of behind the scenes understanding of their conflicts and resolutions, and ways in which they've been able to make peace in those communities. And then, of course, the book, which was hard hitting, but also tried to be very realistic and involve both the victims, the Mormon perpetrators, and also the Native American tribes that had either been blamed for or participated at a distance with. So he really gave me some lovely pointers about how to navigate tough subjects. And I think that's one of the reasons why the church may have given him the charge and the commission to write a biography of Joseph, from the church's position. Because maybe they're hoping that they can tackle some of the really tough stuff of Joseph's life with as much faithful reconciliation as possible. So it'll be interesting to see how he manages that. So
the church recently asked him to do this?
Yeah, so Elder Oaks has commissioned him to do that. So he's got a whole team of people.
So do you know? I can't remember when Rough Stone Rolling wasn't he commissioned by the church Bushman to write that book?
Correct. So
So
that's 2005. So that's now 20
20
years.
years. Okay, so I guess it makes sense for the church to want another author out there. Okay.
And two, that was it right at the beginning of the Joseph Smith Papers, project.
Okay.
And so I think it was kind of okay, here's a biography. We're going to put out these papers. The papers are going to confirm the biography, right? So hopefully it wasn't a big surprise for people. And I suppose now that the Joseph Smith Papers is finished, they want to kind of continue that and say, well, okay, here's where we are at now, 20 years later. And it will still be a number of years away that this project will be done. But it's really interesting when I'm talking to Rick about those things, how he's feeling and what he's hoping to accomplish by examining Joseph's life and obviously from a faithful point of view, but also from a historian point of view. So.
And I think we can also note that Bushman's project actually started when he was working under Arrington when they were going to do was it the sesquicentennial sort of church history series? And John, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's more the case that his initial book, in a way, was commissioned or conceptualized as part of that church-directed project. I think Rough Stone Rolling, it's not a church commission project. It's more of a church encouraged project. Right. Whereas I think it'd be fair to say that Rick's is a commissioned project.
So they'll invest billions into it then, I guess.
Yes. Maybe not billions, but maybe millions. I don't know.
Well,
I'm so envious.
Rick's got a team of 50 people that he's, that are working on this.
Wow.
Ganesh only had like 47.
Yeah.
I wonder, because I guess if a church, I don't know how this works, but I guess if a church is commissioning an author to write things, they can say, hey, put these things in there. Don't make sure these things are not. I'm wondering how much Turley will have his own.
Anyway.
Yeah. Like, will he get to say what goes in there? I wonder, just out of curiosity.
I don't know, but when the church gave him the green light with regard to Mountain Meadows massacre, looking at that, one of the things that he, I guess, advocated for was the idea that, he would have access to everything the church had, and that they would support anything that he put forward. So I think he's been really good at navigating the tough stuff with the brethren and saying, look, trust me. And I think the Mountain Meadows massacre has validated that trust. It really did. Talk about
that's very fair to say. I'm an admirer of both the Mountain Meadows Massacre books, and I will say particularly Vengeance is Mine, the more recent one that he co-authored with Barbara Jones Brown. I really was not keen to read that book. First of all, it's such a grim and sober subject. I'd kind of, I had been working on the Brigham Young time period of church history. I'd kind of moved on from that. I didn't really want to revisit Mountain Meadows, but then I ended up reading it, and I thought it was very hard-hitting, very well written, obviously super well researched. So I couldn't say enough good things about that book.
And I'm interested too, that, particularly your book, John, and also mine. I hope that, the fact that these things are out there and then being played around by the general public and by the Mormon audience, whether that will enable more, kind of forthrightness on the part of this particular book from the church to feel confident that they can talk about these things, I guess, without it being, detrimental or devastating to people's testimony. I have a number of friends who are faithful members who blame Richard Bushman for people leaving the church because of his 2005 biography. So it's really interesting how polarizing that biography was and still is. So it's an interesting space to now be engaged in as a commentator.
I'm just going to jump in and say one thing that I really like about Ganesh's book is he engages, I think, and writes with just great clarity, not just about things that people might at first glance think are really important about the Joseph Smith story. I mean, I think most readers, if they didn't, I mean, obviously Latter-day Saints are going to know a lot, but most readers, they were going to expect him to be writing about the Book of Mormon, which he does really masterfully, and also people expect to hear about Joseph Smith and polygamy. But I really admire the way Ganesh takes on other subjects, such as the settlement of the Americas, patriotism, violent conquest, all sorts of themes that are white supremacy, ideas about race during during Joseph's childhood through his adult life. There's a lot of tough subjects in here, and Ganesh, I love the fact that you write about them at length and with clarity, and in a really straightforward way that I think will be helpful for a lot of readers trying to make sense both of Joseph and the time in which he lived.
Yeah, I'm excited that I'm just excited to be next to your book, really, as a opportunity to learn. So yeah, it's.
I wanted to ask also, were there other scholars or authors or books that you guys turned to while working on your own?
I'll take that first. So yes, I was really conscious very quickly that there were a number of subjects which I didn't have a great understanding of, or may have my own particular bias around and needed clarification for. So I used as many networks as I possibly could to connect to as many scholars and get their take on a lot of things. So Matt Harris looked at a few chapters for me, particularly about white supremacy and slavery. Amanda Hendricks Komodo looked at the patriarchy chapter for me. Thomas Murphy looked at the whole section of Native American stuff for me. Charles Harrell looked at the whole theology section for me and went over it and gave me lots of pointers and lots of corrections. John Lundwell, there were William Davis. I asked for their thoughts, their interpretations of things, and read lots of their work on the subject. Thomas Murphy's got a book coming out at the end of the year, and so he sent me that, so I was able to read that and cite that in my work before it's even published.
That's so cool.
Which was really, really great, and yeah, just. I'm so thankful that there are so many people willing to give some time and look at some of these things and decide that it was worthwhile their time, which I'm incredibly humbled by and grateful for. So it's been a lovely experience actually, and I hope I get to do that for others.
Yeah, that's a really good team of people to have looking at your book. That's really cool.
And there were a few others, like Don Bradley looked at an early manuscript too, he then got a job with kind of a church affiliate group, and he said, "Oh, Ganesh, I really can't do this anymore." And so, but he sent me all his notes for the things that he'd gone through and had a look. And so. And a lot of these people have become, just such great friends, along with, just being very, I feel incredibly lucky to have that. So.
And what about you, John?
I mean, it'd be a really long list. I mean, so history is just, it's necessarily a collective enterprise. And imagine if you just threw somebody in, I don't know, a huge vault with all of the, relevant documents about Joseph Smith, but just like in a big heap. It'd be so hard to take it from scratch. It'd be,
Yeah.
you'd get so much wrong. There'd be so much context you wouldn't understand. So, the Joseph Smith paper volumes, they're just an essential resource for putting all of this in order, for understanding so many details on plural marriage. It's so hard to imagine writing about Joseph biographically without the work of both Todd Compton and Brian Hales, who've unearthed and documented so much. Don Bradley, along with Brian Hales, really. Dan Vogel's work, stretching back decades. I mean, before the Joseph Smith Papers project, Dan's Early Mormon Document series. That's so essential for research into the Smith family and Joseph's childhood years and young adulthood. I have got a number of friends who read the whole or portions of the manuscript, saved me from lots of errors and just bad decisions. So going it alone would be so impossible. But fortunately, the field of Mormon history is so robust. There's so many great essays. Sometimes just amazing essays on smaller subjects within the Joseph Smith story that might appear in an edited volume or in an edition of the Journal of Mormon History, or just get presented at Mormon History Association. So this is a great subfield of history because there's so many great people from all sorts of different points of view examining it together, sometimes arguing with each other, sometimes heatedly. But I think that makes it really fun. So yeah, I got a lot of help.
So I actually have a question sort of related to that, in that I've been talking with some people who have been disaffected from the church and felt like the church at every step of the way lied either through commission or omission about its history and things like that. And so he has embarked on an idea that if everything was a lie, the only people you can trust are the friends, the neighbors, the relatives that weren't in Mormonism. And in a way, I was wondering, well, what would a historian do that still wanted to write a really good, comprehensive research piece, but exclude a lot of the faithful diary entries that they had a really good reason to exclude? And what would that biography look like of Joseph Smith?
Well, what John said before about Dan Vogel's Early Mormon Documents is it's fabulous, because really that was, I guess, Dan Vogel's really huge addition, because a lot of the narrative was controlled by the church and was done from people that were in and Dan compiling those volumes really highlighted out other voices which weren't readily available or quoted or put in, and so that's if you just read through them, they're just a collection of statements by people at various times and cross-reference with each other. You can see that there's a lot of compelling correlated information that are coming from independent people that didn't know each other, that people that didn't talk to each other, but they came up with the same understandings and ideas, which suggests that was the reality of what was going on. So, Dan Vogel's work is incredible, and he's obviously built on that for his biographies, The Making him of Prophet and then Charisma Under Pressure. So, those are the foundation really of understanding Mormonism from kind of the outside looking in. I think is my best take.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, Gene. And I mean, so the backdrop of the question is really important in that the church for a long period of time wasn't opening up its vaults to researchers, was sometimes it was often preventing researchers from access to large numbers of documents, was very much trying to control a faithful official narrative. And so that obviously has bred a massive amount of distrust. So I took an interest in Mormon history late in the first decade of the 2000s. And I basically completely naively showed up in Salt Lake City ready to research a biography of Brigham Young because I'm insane. And over the span of several years, the church let me see the entirety of the Brigham Young papers, including ecclesiastical trials, material about not just Brigham Young's plural marriages, but all sorts of things in which Brigham Young was responding to other people's often messy marriages. So, I sort of showed up on the scene at a time when the church was newly open about its past. And, more recently, the church published the Council of 50 Minutes. At least it's getting close to publishing the William Clayton Journal, which it let me access. So, but I do have to remind myself, for a lot of people, they learned about some of the discordant parts of Mormon history because, somebody purloined a document from the archives or microfilmed it secretly or took notes on it and published it at a time when the church wasn't putting it out there. So there's this huge amount of distrust and suspicion, which is totally reasonable, right? Given that. I still think despite everything, the job of an academic historian is not necessarily the same as an individual seeking the truth. But I feel as if one wouldn't want to only look at some evidence or some witnesses. So when prior to Leonard Arrington, there's a biography of Brigham Young by Stanley Hirschson, who didn't have access to anything in Salt Lake and basically relied on,
sort of hearsay,
Eastern newspaper accounts, I think, and generally pretty critical sources. I mean, it's not as if that doesn't have valuable information in it, but you want to look at as much evidence as you can. And I also think that there's good evidence that, Joseph is, in my mind, he's neither a monster nor a saint in a, non-Latter-day Saint way. He's a super complex human being, and with things that I think a lot of people who met him did admire, and a lot of things that people who became acquainted with him, there were reasons why they were sharply critical of him. And I don't know. I I think you at least want to look at everything and sift through the evidence for different episodes in Joseph's life.
So he's neither a superhero nor a supervillain.
At least for me. And I understand that he is a superhero and a supervillain for a lot of people out there.
He predicted it, right? That's the one prophecy maybe he got right.
His name had for good and evil, yeah.
Right. Yeah, so he said he had to set the record straight and write his own history. Not so easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I?
Oh, go ahead, Julie.
I just have one more question.
Wrap up after.
Yeah, I just have one more question. Do you guys have like a favorite part that you were working on in your books? Like, oh, this scene, or like something like that that you call your favorite?
I had one where something that had not appeared big, that actually I think is really significant, and it was after John Lundwall did his work on literacy in the Americas and ancient America, and I spent some time talking to him about it, and wrote a chapter on the written language as opposed to oral histories, and how this plays out with early 19th century prejudice against Native Americans. The idea that because they had an oral transmission of history, that it was corrupt and it was reliable, and had made them fall, and all these kinds of things. And the idea that the European colonial system of printing press had made the word be a lot more reliable, and things like the Bible accessible, and just what a really interesting dynamic that played out in early 19th century America, and how it plays out in the Book of Mormon, with regard to the real distinguishment of civilization and effectively written word that the Nephites have, and that savagery that the Lamanites had, and how
the whole purpose of Nephi going back to get the plates from Laban, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's without the written word, you are corrupt. This is a major colonial prejudice, of the day. But what happens in Joseph's life is that he starts doing this. So of course, he writes down revelations, and then of course things change. So he has to change the revelations, and then because of that, he gets a lot of pushback from people that go, "You can't change the revelations. This is," and so he goes from this very desire to see things written down to then he stops getting revelations, and he's only doing sermons. And then of course we see him adopt the Masonic rituals into a temple ceremony and endowment, and of course these aren't written down, they're memorized, and so actually in Joseph's life, he goes from this really wanting things written down because that's more reliable, incredibly, you're not going to falter, it's not going to be corrupted over time, to the point where he realizes he needs flexibility. So the church relies on this oral kind of transmission. Like the endowment ceremony is not written down till 1877. It's only 1876, I think.
I don't think I thought of that before.
Yeah,
when it was written down.
Yeah, so then this kind of oratory, sermon, memorization, culture comes up in the church as a kind of a counter to this idea that the written word, is going to be too constraining, because people are going to, look at the words and they're going to be worried if you change them. So it's just a really interesting arc, and it's such a beautiful understanding of humanity and the ways that we deal with the way that we transmit language, in written or oratory forms. So yeah, and that was just one of my fun little things that I found really interesting.
William Davis might think and theorize that for the endowment, they might have had like 3x5 cards that had the heads of the next chapter for each of the situations that you're in for the endowment.
Contemporaneous, ritual, which is an interesting thought.
I would have had to write something down on my palm at least.
Yeah. So the question is one story or episode that really stood out to me, Julia.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So one episode that I enjoyed working through, for even though it's sort of a prelude to a sad episode, is there's that time right near the end of Joseph's life where he flees Nauvoo to avoid arrest, and he is considering what to do next. He contemplates traveling to Washington or heading up north to Wisconsin. And there's this long-standing narrative that Utah church leaders perpetuated, that Emma and other people who didn't have Joseph's best interests at heart, sort of pushed Joseph to return by accusing him of cowardice in leaving the people behind to save himself. And as I looked into the sources, that really seems not to have been the case, that Joseph and others got some additional information that Governor Thomas Ford intended to protect him, and that Joseph, instead of just being browbeaten into returning, took some time, prayed about it, and apparently, according to Violet Kimball, got the word and will of the Lord that he should return. And she's writing that, I think, just a couple of days after Joseph's death. So it's a really contemporary source. And so I think that's one instance in which contemporary sources can help us avoid some of the prejudices of later sources. I'm not saying that things that are earlier are always better than later sources. That'd be too simple. But I just also think it's one of those quite a few moments in Joseph's life. I think we're so used to the arc of his story, and especially if one takes him seriously as a prophet, he must sort of always have known what to do. But I think there are a lot of episodes in Joseph's life where he finds himself in a predicament or crisis, sometimes of his own making, maybe sometimes less so, and he just doesn't know what to do. And I think that's the case after the expulsion of the Saints from Jackson County. In a personal way, I think that's definitely the case in June of 1844. I think it was the case for a lot of the last couple of years in Nauvoo. He's in this deepening crisis, and he has no idea how to get out of it, and doesn't see any good path forward. And I think that's one human element of Joseph, that whether you're sympathetic to him or not, I think people almost presume a little too much. And I think often he's a human being full of anxiety, fear, indecision. I think that comes out really strongly toward the end of his life.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody. I want people to know, and I'm going to go full screen for me because, my wife, she likes it when I'm full screen. But I first heard of John from this book compiled by Joseph Geisner, and John is the last name on this. It's a list of people who wrote about their story of writing Mormon history. And that was fascinating to me. It's like how people got into history. Half of the authors that listed here weren't scholars, weren't educators. They were just regular people that came across something and had a question. And that's today. We have half of the scholars today. We have, our half of the people on our guest show today are not scholars, and John is. And also, I want people to see. John, do you have your book somewhere?
Yep, I've got it.
I've got it here.
Oh,
Oh,
cool.
there you go.
Let's see.
Ganesh, I'm sorry, I've got my copy of your book at home. So
Yeah.
apologies
So
for
there's-
that.
And we'll have links to that. And here's Ganesh has his copy, but it's better if I show my copy, I think.
That's great.
So that way it doesn't look like Ganesh was, only did this show just so that he could get his book on screen.
Actually, I don't even have a copy with me at the moment because I'm traveling.
There you go.
Yeah, I've got some waiting for me in Kansas City when I get there.
This is the very best book I've ever read that lists Julia Sanders and Gene Judson in the acknowledgments. I'll have to say that.
And it also lists John Turner, although I was talking about my John Turner, not this one.
Oh, that's funny.
At the time.
Oh. It's a good thing I didn't ask a question about that earlier then.
It's almost as common a name as Joseph Smith.
There you go.
So,
You could have been prophet of some other religion. You just never know.
Common and extraordinary at the same time. That's quite a feat.
Yeah. So does anybody have any parting words they'd like to say about anything?
Well, just thanks, Jean, Julia, for this opportunity to discuss. I mean, one of the things that John wrote in the book that he gave me, which is just so lovely. He said, fun to share a historical subject with you, and the idea that we have this person 200 years ago who has such an effect, and we're able to examine his life and get incredibly insightful understandings about his world, but also how it kind of permeates into the future with all of us is quite a special thing, and we've got to be thankful for that. It's incredible.
Yep. Likewise, I think Gene, you were drawing a distinction between scholars and regular people, but I would push back against that a little bit and say that Ganesh is a great scholar, and I'm not totally irregular. So really enjoyed this conversation, and honored to be on here alongside Ganesh.
Yeah. And I'll say that John acknowledges a Ganesh Cherian, but it was a totally different Ganesh Cherian, probably. No, I'm just kidding. So anyway, and thanks, Julia, for helping me.
Yeah, of course. This has been really fun. It's been really fun watching you guys on Mormon Stories and other platforms. So this is fun.
That's right.
Great.
Thanks, everybody, for watching. Like, share, and subscribe. Do the things, and have a great rest of 2025. Bye-bye.
Fabulous.